Our gospel reading for this morning comes from the 9th chapter of Luke on this Transfiguration Sunday. And every year we hear from one of the synoptic gospels, that is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This passage, probably more so than some other Sundays, points out the problem of the way we read Scripture in worship, pulling out brief passages and removing them from context. Context is especially important today. Jesus has just come from episodes where Peter has professed that Jesus is in fact the Messiah. Jesus has then told them of his own impending death in Jerusalem. And he has then taught them that those who follow him must deny self, take up the cross, be willing to lose their life. And that is in mind when we begin the reading for today. In fact, Luke's Gospel makes reference to those things in our passage for this morning. And so let us now listen attentively for what the Spirit will say to us this day. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure. The Greek word is literally exodus, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed away, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings or booths, shrines of some sort. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my Son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. Just then a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child." Suddenly a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon convulsed him to the ground. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And all were astounded at the greatness of God. The word of the Lord. Some of you may be familiar with French writer and philosopher Albert Camus. You may have had to read The Stranger in high school or college literature. And Camus was an agnostic and also a pacifist. And yet he became a part of the French underground during World War II after having witnessed Nazi atrocities in occupied France. And though he was an agnostic, he was on an occasion asked to speak to an audience of Christians. And out of his experience of World War II, of the horrors of that war and the Holocaust, he spoke these words to those gathered Christians. I want to just read some of them to you. He said, "What the world expects of Christians is that Christians should speak out loud and clear, and that they should voice their condemnation in such a way that never a doubt, never the slightest doubt could arise in the heart of the simplest man. that they should get away from abstraction and confront the blood-stained face history has taken on today. The grouping we need is a grouping of people resolved to speak out clearly and to pay up personally. Perhaps we cannot prevent this world from being a world in which children are tortured, but we can reduce the number of tortured children. And if you don't help us, who else in the world can help us? It may be, I am well aware, he continues, that Christianity will answer negatively. Oh, not by your mouths, I am convinced. But it may be, and this is even more probable, that Christianity will insist on maintaining a compromise, or else on giving its condemnation the obscure form of the encyclical. Possibly it will lose all the virtue of revolt and indignation that belonged to it long ago. In that case, Christians will live and Christianity will die. I stumbled across this quote in a book on Christian doctrine that I'm using to teach that class that caused me to forget my sermon. And it was in a chapter entitled, "Are You a Christian? The Doctrine of Sanctification." And Shirley Guthrie, the Presbyterian theologian who wrote this book, says that Camus, a non-believer, is challenging the Christians here to take seriously our own doctrine of sanctification. And sanctification is about when we recognize that we have been embraced and forgiven by a loving God, that we have been adopted as beloved children, that we then begin to live as children, that we allow the Spirit to work within us so that it transforms us and we actually begin to act like children of God. And I think that Luke is talking about the very same thing when he gives us his take on Jesus on the mountaintop. Luke writes his gospel sometime later than Matthew and Mark wrote theirs. Luke writes in a time when the church is just beginning to have to wrestle with the fact that the anticipated quick return of Jesus is not going to happen, that it's going to be a while before he comes back. He writes at a time when the church is becoming less and less Jewish and more Gentile. And as he writes in this time of the earliest followers of Jesus beginning to die off, he uses this story of Jesus on the mountain to answer a question about what does it mean to be Christian. Now, although the account he gives is quite similar to that in Matthew and Mark, there are some interesting differences. For example, Luke explicitly links the events on the mountain with what had preceded it, with those sayings from before, where Jesus has said, if anyone wants to follow me, they must deny themselves and take up their cross. Where he said that whoever wants to save their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will save it. Luke also is the only one to tell us about what Jesus talks about with Elijah and Moses on the mountain, his impending departure to be accomplished at Jerusalem. And only Luke tells us that links the Transfiguration so closely to what happens when they come down the mountain, where Jesus' disciples cannot heal a young boy and Jesus is exasperated by the whole thing. And in the middle of all this, a heavenly voice speaks, telling Peter and James and John and us, listen to him.